Starlight Express, Starlight Express, Starlight Express, Starlight Express, Starlight Express, Starlight Express. Oh my god, hey. Welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. My name is Mickey Jo, and I am obsessed with all things theatre. I am a professional theatre critic here on social media, and this is my theatre-themed YouTube channel where I review the shows that I have been invited to go and see, both in the UK and increasingly worldwide. You may also be hearing me on a podcast platform somewhere. Hello to you. If you are used to only seeing me on YouTube and you didn't know, thanks to my very helpful stagey fiancé Erin James, you can now also find all of my theatre reviews on the usual podcast platforms, so you can listen to them while you're cooking, while you're sleeping, while you're getting the train maybe around the country, which is appropriate because today we're going to be talking all about the brand new revival of Andrew Lloyd Webber's Starlight Express. Are you excited? I'm excited. Do you know what? I love talking about all kinds of theatre on here. I like plays, I like musicals, but I particularly love musical theatre, as well you know. I particularly love talking about musical theatre revivals because I feel like it's where I have the most insight and the most to say about choices that have been made. And I feel like we're never really closer than when I'm talking about a Lloyd Webber show, so this just feels like a perfect day, honestly. And there's lots to discuss because today I'm going to be reviewing this completely new production of the show. If you don't know, this is a new creative team. It is a new direction. There are some new characters. There are some new songs. It's a slightly new take on the material. There are new costumes. There's a new set design. So I'm going to be telling you all about those changes. I'm going to be letting you know how successful I thought they were. We're going to be talking about the production sort of at large, big picture ideas about whether or not I think this is successful. Worth bearing in mind throughout that the criteria by which we are reviewing this is how well does this succeed at delivering the objectives of a Starlight Express. That's the thing to focus on here. Obviously, you can't hold this up against something like a Next to Normal that I saw a few days before. Very different shows with very different ideas. This one is about singing trains. And if you're one of the people who knows absolutely nothing about Starlight Express, then I'm going to give you a little bit of the history of the show, and I'm going to do my best to tell you about the synopsis of the show and this particular version of it. So there will be some spoilers for some of the changes for the new production. I will be telling you about what happens in the plot, but for what it's worth, plot is a strong word on this occasion. So get those safety helmets on and get ready for my full review of Starlight Express at the Troubadour Theatre in Wembley Park. Of course, if you've already had a chance to see the show, I would love to know what you thought of it as well. Comment down below with all of your thoughts and feelings about this new production. Are you a fan of the original? Was this your first time seeing the show? What is your perspective on Starlight Express? And if you enjoy this review, then make sure to subscribe to me right here on YouTube, turn on those notifications so you don't miss any of my upcoming video reviews and vlogs and news videos. If you're listening to this on one of those podcast platforms, then follow me there as well. And you can also find me across the internet on other social media platforms. I am on the app formerly known as Twitter. I am on TikTok. I am on Instagram at MickeyJoTheatre, bringing you all sorts of theatrical content. For now though, no further delays because it is departure time for the full review of Starlight Express. Let's talk about the train show. So, Starlight Express was a 1980s mega musical by Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber. If you want to know what it's about, it's basically Cats but with trains. That honestly is a very accurate explanation of the show. The concept is that a young child is playing with their toy trains and the world of the show exists within their imagination. And it all builds towards this epic race to determine which of the trains is going to be the champion of the world. A little bit like how Cats centers around this whole competition idea and they're all taking turns to showcase themselves. Starlight Express does a very similar thing and is similarly laden with underlying psychosexual politics, which from the whole perspective of this being a child's imagination, a little bit weird, but different in this new version, and we'll get to why. Anyway, Starlight Express opened in the early 1980s in the West End. Later that decade, headed over to Broadway, and, excuse me, gonna put this down. It shortly afterwards opened in Bochum, Germany, where it is still running today. It is the most successful musical in Germany of all time. And it was pretty successful in the West End as well, leaving an entire generation with great memories of that original production. And the memories of that original production are, you know, filled with wonderment because the things that they did on stage were really unprecedented. It is now being brought back in an era when we talk about immersive theatre and immersive musical theatre all the time to different extents. Shows that sort of have like you walk through an atmospheric area in order to get to the auditorium, and that's like an immersive pre-show. Shows where, you know, the cast members are running through the aisles to get to the stage. All sorts of different levels of stuff that's actually immersive, where like they're gutting the theatre and you're now standing on the dance floor, to stuff that's just kind of toying with the idea of immersive. But Starlight Express had actors on roller skates playing trains and coaches and engines, skating around the auditorium, and they built a track that allowed them to skate up to the dress circle level and high-five you going past, and you know, you were thrilled because you're high-fiving an actor playing a roller skating train, and because it was the early 1980s, you probably paid 50p for that front row dress circle seat. But it was vivid and colourful and campy and vibrant and dynamic and explosive and hugely successful, if a little bit hazardous. For more insight as to exactly how, you can go and check out my good friend Brendan's video over on Wait in the Wings here on YouTube for an insight into the sort of dark early history of Starlight Express. But what's important for you to know from all of this is that there was so much love, and still is, for that original production. And love like that later turns into nostalgia. Yes, I did go see Inside Out 2 in cinemas today. In fact, I just got back. Lovely film. And when a show like that gets revived in a production that makes different choices and updates things and changes things, there is always going to be a little bit of resistance, especially when a version much more similar, though not identical, to the original version of the show is still running elsewhere, the production that still runs in Bochum, Germany, in a larger arena with more familiar costumes of the original production, but also with updates to the score. This is the other thing, is that not unlike a lot of Lloyd Webber musicals, Starlight Express has had many, many, many updates to the material. I was just listening to the original cast recording the other day, and it's wild how many lyrics are discernibly the same, but just ever so slightly rephrased in a way that doesn't feel like they were improved or made worse. They're just different for almost no reason. Last time I made a video talking about this show, someone made a fantastic comment comparing it to the Ship of Theseus. The implication is that the show has been changed so many times it barely has any resemblance exactly to the original version, except for the fact that it largely still follows the same narrative. So let me tell you about that plot. Let's talk about trains, baby. Let's talk about diesel and steam. Let's talk about all the good trains and the bad trains. Yes, you heard me. There are bad trains. This is not strong enough. Now, my explanation of the plot of Starlight Express could and should and possibly will be a video entirely of its own at some point, but for now let me give you a little bit of an insight as to the plot of this particular updated version of the show. So we meet a young child at the beginning who is playing with their trains, and their mum comes in and tells them it's time to go to bed and sings them a lullaby. After their mother leaves, however, the child wakes back up and announces that tonight is going to be the big race, and it's then that we disappear into the world of the toy trains. And the child introduces all of the competitors, including the reigning champion Greaseball, the diesel engine, who has carbon emissions and an ego. Soon afterwards, we meet the coaches, who in this production are Dinah, the dining car, Tacitus, the quiet car, Belle, the sleeping car, and the new arrival, Pearl, who is traditionally the first-class coach. I didn't notice in this production whether they actually make any specific reference to that being her thing in this one, but she is the new coach on the block. We also meet Rusty, an old steam engine who has an ambition to race and be a champion, but is looked down on by all of the other trains. The other, I shouldn't call them trains, locomotives. They're only trains when they're coupled. I'm learning a lot about trains over the course of making these videos. Stay tuned for the Francis Bourgeois collab. He definitely doesn't know who I am. The next characters to be introduced are the freight trains, and something that you should note here is that when the races take place, the participants, the engines, have to couple to a coach, whether that's one of the passenger coaches, who I've mentioned to you by name already, or one of these freight trucks. Now we meet Lumber and Porter, I believe, who are essentially unimportant. We meet Slick Oil, who will be relevant later on in this plot, and Hydra. This is the new character for this production. Hydra is a hydrogen container whose importance in the narrative will emerge in its final act. But the whole race is also shaken up by the arrival of the mysterious and wealthy Elektra and their entourage. Elektra is the electric train of the future, or at least was the electric train of the future in the early 1980s, and is now sort of nostalgically the train of the... Anyway, it's an electric train. Then we have some qualifying races. Rusty is given encouragement by an older steam train called Mama, who used to be a champion, and when Rusty decides that there's no point in him racing because he's being a surly teenage train, I guess, Mama races for him, Doc Hudson in Cars style, to prove a point. And this is where the psychosexual politics of it all come into play, because there's a lot of coupling, uncoupling, and recoupling between the engines and the carriages. And that, I think, is as much of the plot I can tell you without really specific spoilers, But to give you a sense of what is new to this production, I want to tell you about two things that happen in the second act. These are spoilers. If you don't want to know, skip to the next section, which will be coming soon. So two of those freight trucks are very consequential. Slick Oil kind of takes on the role that CB / the Red Caboose played in previous productions, wherein they, for motives of their own, money, decide to join forces with Greaseball and Elektra separately to plot to make sure that Rusty can't go on to win the final race via cheating. Now, though Rusty is immediately enamored with Pearl, she lacks almost any conviction and partners with, whichever successful train seems to ask her nicely, or not even nicely. First, she initially partners with Elektra and then recouples with Greaseball the Diesel, who abandons her during the last race, leaving Rusty to save her. But prior to her coming to her train senses, Rusty partnered with Hydra, the hydrogen carriage. Now, everyone was very resistant to hydrogen throughout all of this because they were like, no, you're dangerous and explosive and you're really heavy. And it's only towards the end that Hydra's like, I'm actually super light and a very efficient fuel source. Please don't at me in the comments if anything I'm saying is not scientifically sound, because my basis for all of this is the musical Starlight Express. Like, I'm just trusting their scientific theory here. I'm not a man of science. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I am not Mickey Jo Trains. What I will say is that having hydrogen in there in the final sequence, when after Rusty wins the final race and Greaseball and Elektra both like, can we be converted to steam, seems to give it, to my mind, a little bit more legitimacy, because previously, when they were like, yeah, you can all become steam trains, I was always sat there thinking, I'm not sure that this is actually, like, scientifically sound. I don't know if this is a good thing. This seems to be perpetrating a very steam-based driven agenda. I'm like, did a steam train pay for this show? Is this whole thing being funded by Big Steam? Like, what's going on here? But now the Hydra is at least on stage and they're like, you can become a steam train with hydrogen. So, I guess slightly more environmentally conscious by having hydrogen in the show. Hydra also sings a little philosophical refrain of sorts dozens of times in this show that goes, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when for hydrogen. And I'm not joking when I tell you that you will hear that upwards of a dozen times, but then that's something that happens in Starlight Express, because if they like a little section of a song, they're gonna sing it 5 more times. Speaking of which, let me tell you about what I actually think of this show's material separately to this new production. Do I just like Starlight Express as a show? Well, the answer to this question is yeah. I enjoy Starlight Express. Listen, it lives in the guilty pleasure part of my brain. I know some people take musical theatre incredibly seriously, and fairly enough, but I have an enormous fondness for Cats and for Starlight Express at the same time. I'm also a Disney adult as well as a discerning theatre critic, and I think I have an incredibly well-nurtured inner child that allows me to enjoy stuff like this. I'm under no illusion that this is like highbrow esteemed work. I think many of the little tinkerings and changes it's had over the years are just sort of incidental and occasionally puzzling, but for every objectively poor and repeated lyric, such as, I must find Pearl, I must find Pearl, I must find Pearl, I must find Pearl, during which Rusty's motivations are obviously incredibly ambiguous, you have really great ones like, look out for the carriage who's out to disparage. I mean, come on now. The title song Starlight Express is also one of those really great Andrew Lloyd Webber melodic hooks that has stayed with me since childhood. Starlight Express, Starlight Express. And yet the other one that stayed with me since I first saw this show on tour as a very young child was A Lot of Locomotion. Now we need to talk about this song. This is, I think, one of the most changed songs in the history of Starlight Express, because there is always a song through which the coaches introduce themselves. Traditionally, the coaches are played by women and the engines are played by men. Different in this production, and we'll get to why. But as such, they had a slightly more feminine song, and in the original, it was very much them taking turns to be like, which of us is the sexiest train? Featuring such iconic lyrics as Come and Bite My Boygers, I'm hot and cheap and quick, because she's the dining car, obviously, as well as the infamous Ashley the smoking car, who sang, I know if I don't give up I might choke or have a stroke, gee that scares me, and when I'm scared, boy I need a smoke. That was eventually axed in the early 2000s and replaced with A Whole Lot of Locomotion, which was made to sound more like the girl band music of the time. A whole lot of locomotion. Interestingly enough, the melody of the actual title section of that was later appropriated for the Denise Van Outen-led version of Tell Me on a Sunday, and then later again for Love Never Dies, it became the song The Beauty Underneath, and so they just slightly changed A Whole Lot of Locomotion, but now it's out of the show anyway. A Whole Lot of Locomotion, it's worth noting, was sort of no less filled with innuendo, but it was more briefly at the beginning. You had the sleeping car at that point called Duvet singing, "I'm Duvet, I'm a sleeper, but you won't get much sleep." And Pearl introducing herself by singing, "My name's Pearl, I'm the first class girl. My springs still bounce, my fans still whirl," which I'll let you read into at your choice. So we went from cutesy sexy train song to girl band sexy train song, and then we took a really hard pivot into strong feminist train anthem. This was introduced in a workshop version of the show when it was being retooled a few years ago. It was then rolled out, literally, in the German production. It's called Ich bin ich over there, and it now appears for the first time in an English language production in this newly updated version of the show, and it's called I Am Me. Although this new version, not completely identical to the workshop version and the version that was recorded for Bochum, because it has a different middle eight that I'm led to believe has been appropriated from another Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, Whistle Down the Wind, and is taken from the song Tire Tracks and Broken Hearts. Someone told me as much in a comment anyway, and it did not surprise me. But back to my overall thoughts on Starlight, I do have a lot of nostalgia for it, which on the one hand, does it taint my perception of the show? On the other hand, is this a show that is largely created for a younger audience anyway? Is this meant to inspire and excite the next generation of theatregoer, particularly this new production? Is this meant to bring Starlight to a new generation of young audiences? Is that kind of who the thing is for? And if that is the case, is that nostalgic lens the best way to view the show? I also think that the music is not only catchy, it's incredibly clever. A lot of it has that sort of driving momentum and train sound, and you know, the way that the music has been stylized to the different characters, the way that Greaseball's machismo and ego is written into this sort of like rock and rolly Elvis Presley style presence, and then Elektra's introductory number is all synthy and unsurprisingly electric. But you also hear the sound of trains in so many of the melodies and the motifs of this show. In the song Freight, where you're hearing like you're hearing the sound of trains moving on tracks. Similarly in the whole like recurring motif in the show, where it's like so I do think there's a lot to love about Starlight Express. When we talk about its legacy, we also have to acknowledge the brilliant work of its original choreographer, Dame Arlene Phillips, who is retained in this new production as a creative dramaturg and consultant. But what the show has always done is position itself somewhere at the intersection of credible musical theatre and theme park style entertainment, where you're enjoying the songs and the performances and the acting and the storytelling, but you also have, you know, the visual wonder and the thrill of the whole thing, and the excitement and the pace of these race sequences. And it may not surprise you to learn, I'm not someone who goes to a lot of live sporting events, but I do feel, even in this new production, that the energy in the room is somewhere between a musical theatre audience and the energy at like a cage fight, because there is that excitement to it. Like, you don't really get the same level of thrill when you're watching My Fair Lady. That's no shade on My Fair Lady, but you know, they're not on wheels. Nor, for what it's worth, do I think they should be. Anyway, I think it's time that I tell you about this new production of the show and what I thought of it. So this revival has been directed by Luke Shepherd, whose star is very much on the rise. He recently directed The Little Big Things at Soho Place. Prior to that, he had directed And Juliet in the West End and on Broadway. He also directed Rob Madge's show, My Sons Are Queer, But What Can You Do? And the through line with a lot of his recent work has been a very heartfelt sentimentality, as well as valuable queer representation. Both of those are strong factors in this new production of Starlight Express, because it does feel like this is geared very much towards a family, and specifically a child audience. Previous productions of the show and the original production of the show, like I mentioned to you in some of those earlier lyrics, had more adult subversive elements, and this one feels a lot sort of cleaner overall. Choices have seemingly been made to make the whole thing a little bit more socially progressive. It's no longer the case that all of the racing engines are played by male performers and all of the coaches are played by female performers. Greaseball is now a canonically female character. One of the coaches, Tacitus, is portrayed and understudied, I believe, by male performers, and Elektra is a non-binary character. And if that sounds like a little bit of frivolous virtue signaling to you, I don't think it is, because, you know, for one thing, they're all locomotives. I need to remind you of this when people get mad at the gender of these trains and the costumes that the human beings are wearing while portraying these trains. They're singing trains. Like, I think that's It's great to have an enormous love for the show and to take it very seriously, and this show has a beautiful fan community and a lot of love for it. At the same time, they are singing trains. I think we should all remember that. So Elektra, being a non-binary character, it's really not very heavy-handed, nor do I think it's a problem that you have a non-binary villain, or indeed a lesbian villain, because Greaseball does seem to still have an amorous connection to Dinah. I'll expand on that in just a moment's time, bear with me. It's really just that Elektra is referred to exclusively with they, them pronouns, and in terms of how people are depicted, you know, these costumes are so bright and elaborate. None of them really feel particularly like masculine or feminine coded necessarily. In any case, what Elektra represents is the arrival of the electric train as a concept, so them being a non-binary character allows them to be more of a concept than an individual. I mentioned I would talk more about the relationship between Greaseball and Dinah. If anyone's seen Steven Universe, there's something that happens when the gem characters within that do fusion together, where it's a sort of a practical team up thing, but it also has a little bit of a romantic connotation. The same thing happens in Starlight Express, where when they couple up with each other, it's for, you know, functional purposes, but it also has a little bit of a romantic meaning because Dinah is distraught when Greaseball couples up to another coach, because Dinah cares very deeply for Greaseball. Similarly, when Pearl is weighing whether she wants to race with Rusty or with Elektra, she sings "Someone Help Me Make Up My Heart" because it's a romantic decision and not just a practical one. Back to the show having been updated, so the song they use for the coaches is the strong feminist anthem, and in order to give them an impetus to sing this, they are given a little bit of grief by the engines, who are like, you're all coaches and you wouldn't go anywhere if you didn't have us to pull you along. And it's very like chauvinistic and misogynistic, except for the fact that gender is no longer really a component of all of this. So it's just the obnoxious engines being rude to the coaches. And the idea of that and what it represents, I agree with, and I am behind you. Power to the coaches. However, the issue I have is that later in the show it goes back to being flirtatious and like, you know, you want to race with me. And originally, when they were flirtatious from the off with the coaches, that made a little bit more sense than them putting them down before ultimately realizing that they do still need them in order to qualify for the race. It's just a little bit of an unusual U-turn, which needless to say is not something that trains can do very well or very easily, and it means that Dinah's whole relationship with Greaseball comes kind of out of nowhere, as does Dinah's entire character, if we're being honest. As I mentioned earlier, the entire existence of Hydra, the hydrogen train, which is very hard to say, as a character kind of tidies up the scientific and environmental focus of the whole thing, and there is another aspect which is the geographical one, because this race is for the fastest train in the world, and they used to be competitors from all around the globe. And so the first trains who were introduced at the beginning were called the national trains, and you had trains with different nationalities. There was a Russian train, and there was a German train, and there was a Japanese bullet train. And these were both named and characterized with broad racial identities, which I guess in 2024 is also something they wanted to literally steer clear of. So instead, they are now just associated with colors, and you have like the golden eagle and the green arrow and the silver bullet. But as we often see with original material that's been reworked, things linger still. And there are a couple of jokes about a British train being delayed and being cancelled by Network Rail, which is always going to get a laugh with a British audience, especially a British audience that's made it out to Wembley Park. I guarantee you half of those people have had train issues just getting there. We were delayed on the way back, completely unironically. Objectively hilarious to leave a performance of Starlight Express and then get on a train that is delayed due to heavy traffic on the lines. That's like leaving Julius Caesar and getting stabbed. The other thing, and there are a few Lloyd Webber scores, especially the early stuff, that do this, is we do go on a little bit of a musical tour around the world. If you remember Joseph, you know that there is a Calypso song, there is a hoedown, and Starlight Express also gets into this vibe of exploring different world musical styles, because when we first meet Mama, the older steam engine, who used to be Popper, the older steam engine, whose gender was changed years ago for the German production originally. This character sings a blues song that discernibly has nothing to do with locomotion, but it's just a joke about blues music. Greaseball, Elektra, and Slick Oil sing a song called One Rock and Roll Too Many, where they are sort of characterized as these heavy rock stars. And Dinah sings a song called UNCOUPLED, the reality of which is so upsetting she can only bring herself to spell it, if not say it, which is very country music. Except in this version of the show, everyone speaks with a British accent and sings with a British accent. So Dinah, when doing UNCOUPLED, it hits a little bit weird because we don't really know why we're suddenly hearing country music performed in a very British way. And I feel the same way about Mama's Blues and One Rock and Roll Too Many. It kind of feels like they're just slightly odd moments because, you know, some of them advance the plot, others literally just stop the whole thing to have a number, but it's not quite clear why they're happening in that kind of a stylistic way. Now, I started touching on this, but there is more tangible queer representation within this show, and you know, why not? I honestly do not think changing the genders of really any of these characters makes a lick of difference. And in fact, with the child character of Control, they are portrayed by both young boys and young girls in this production, because it really doesn't make any difference whatsoever. It's just a child playing with trains, and anyone can like trains. Now, about Control, this is one of the other big changes with this production, because where Control previously has just been an omnipresent voice throughout the proceedings, we actually see Control on stage constantly in this version of the show. They are present, they are riding a scooter around along with the race marshals, who are performers doing scooter tricks while everyone else is on roller skates. And one little twist is at the end, when Mama tells them that if they do get converted to steam, they'd be under their own control. Previously, you had the voice of Control being like, "What are you talking about? No, you have to answer to Control." And then they were like, "Bye-bye, child voice." In this one, because the child is standing right there, even though Mama says the line, "You'd be under your own control," nods to Control, who's like, "That's right." And I'm like, doesn't necessarily make sense, but they didn't want to turn the actual child on stage into the villain, and fair enough. More big picture thoughts before I tell you specifically about what this production kind of like looks like and how it works. I do think, like I said, it has been kind of trivialized a little bit more for a child audience. It's been made a little bit more child friendly. The whole thing feels a little more juvenile, a little bit more sentimental. The through line about this beginning in the child's bedroom and transporting us into that world and then ending with a nod to it as well is given an awful lot of clarity. There is a space mobile above their bed which goes up and is replaced by a larger version with big planets coming down in the auditorium, and a lot of nods to stars throughout the whole thing later. And I like that in as much as it makes it clear that, you know, the scale of the whole thing is changing and that we are being transported into that formerly small world. There are also graphics on the back screens that have planets where the rings running around them are train tracks. And with this, and with the return of the planets, other points during the show, I don't know why it draws this parallel between the trains and space, because as someone who was very interested in space as a child and had planets and glow-in-the-dark stars stuck all around my bedroom, I was never that into trains. I also have a cousin who was really into trains, and from what I know was never that much into space. So I don't know, I mean, for some people, sure, there's an overlap. I just don't know why this production is leaning so hard into space, and in its design as well. It's a little bit like Tron-esque, a little bit Transformers in the costuming, and just a little bit spacey. It doesn't necessarily invoke like classic railway as much as it invokes like space age trains. I feel like it would be fair to call the narrative of the thing enduringly a little bit unsophisticated. I think with anything that is family aimed, that dial can move in one of two directions. It can either be geared more towards adult audiences or more towards child ones, and it feels like that's the direction that we've gone in. It feels just a little bit more Lazy Town. It feels a little bit more like Disney Junior. Everything is directed and played in a way that's quite broad and quite obvious, and almost nothing acting-wise calls for a lot of nuance. But again, it's Starlight Express, and so you're going for the storytelling, but you're also going for the spectacle. The question that emerges from that is, does the spectacle deliver? So let me tell you about the actual theatre-going experience, what the auditorium is like, what the visuals are like, and what the races are like. So this whole thing is being staged at the Troubadour Theatre in Wembley Park. The most recent tenant of that theatre was Newsies, which felt like it was in this huge cavernous space. Interestingly enough, the way they've converted this auditorium into the Starlight Auditorium, as it is now called, feels a lot more intimate. And I have to say, everything about the construction of this space, everything about the building, honestly, and the foyer experience, when you go in, and just the whole theatre-going arrival experience is really cool. That first look at the stage when you enter the theatre, it's all blue and light and, again, semi-futuristic, but it's cool. The set has this central circular playing space with tiered audience seating blocks amongst it and 2 submerged audience seating blocks in front of it, and then there is a little circular track that runs around the outside of those. Behind that circular track there are 2 then tiered sort of and submerged seating blocks, and then there's a larger oval track, and there's a gangway that runs down this whole thing, and then behind the larger oval track you have tiered seating going all the way back. But none of these feel very far from the stage. You're getting a different experience in all of them. The first time I went to the show, I was sat in the tiered seating at the back and I got a great overview of everything. The second time, when I went for a press performance, I was sat in one of the rear submerged seating sections outside of that first circular lap, but in front of the oval circular lap, so they were occasionally going behind me. And nothing much happens that's of importance when they do go behind you, and you can still see 2 screens that show footage of them when they're doing the races, but you don't feel like you're necessarily getting the broadest overview. So it's up to you. If you want to be closer so you can see the emotions, again, they're singing trains, that's a choice you can make. There are 2 other blocks of seating that are on an upper level, because as well as the central playing space, there are ramps that go up behind the stage, as well as an on-stage ramp that people come down up to a raised level, and there are 2 seating sections that are up on the same level as this raised level. Those ones do feel like they are discernibly behind the stage, and I wouldn't recommend them for your first visit to the show, because it feels like you are behind the action. Really cool way to see it if you're going for a return visit, methinks. Now, in terms of the actual aesthetic of the set design, I think it's really cool. Like I said, very blue, very Tron, very space age. I do wonder why the whole thing is done with concentric lines rather than, and this is like in the barriers that come down along the sides of those ramps onto the stage, rather than having a line at the top and bottom and then perpendicular lines going across to make them look like train tracks. It does just feel like we lose the classic railway aesthetic a little bit in favor of something more futuristic. And I get that it is sci-fi and it's fantastical. I just think when I was looking at those projections on the top screens of planets with rings with train track crisscross lines, I was like, that's very clever and whimsical, and I wish they'd had that same idea in the set design. That set design was the work of Tim Hatley in association with Ross Edwards, and the video design was from Andre Golding. The other key aesthetic creative we have to tell you about is Gabriella Slade, who has designed the costumes, a Tony Award winner for her costume design on 6, and there are, as people have pointed out, similarities between some of the characters' costuming in Starlight Express and 6, specifically the coaches. I wouldn't say that the rest of the costumes are giving much familiarity to 6, any more so than the original Starlight Express costumes bore a little bit of a resemblance to 6, honestly. And I think it's the peplum skirts and the use of like block colours that is doing it, but Starlight Express has always had like block colour characters, and the peplum skirts cleverly invoke that kind of thing at the front of the train. Being closer for my second viewing of the show this weekend for the press performance, I got the chance to see more of the details on the costume, and, you know, they're not necessarily subtle, like it's clear what they're referencing, just like in 6 when the queens have their Roman numerals as to which number wife they were on like earrings and jewellery. The same thing happens with the coaches, so Belle, the sleeping coach, has Zs all over her outfit for like little like cartoon snoring. Dinah's whole checkerboard thing invokes the idea of like a retro American diner. Rusty and Mama both have actual steam coming out of their costumes. A lot of the costumes have fun light up elements which are really cool. They all have stylized helmets now during the race sequences. Elektra has these like inflatable pointy wings. It's a little bit Lady Gaga inspired, I think. Greaseball is this striking neon yellow colour, familiar of a yellow diesel train. Elektra's entourage have these sleek bleach blonde wigs that are kind of like 90s supermodel-esque. Like, I really enjoy a lot of the aesthetics. Do I think they're as strong as the original Starlight Express aesthetics? It's largely difficult to say. Again, I think they are going with this new creative brief where the whole thing is a little bit more futuristic, a little bit more sort of animated and cartoonish, and probably a lot more engaging for children than the original one that toyed with more train familiar elements. But then you had characters like Elektra in the original one who didn't look like a train at all. Elektra looked like an American football mascot had a baby with a toilet brush. And you also can't tell me that those original Starlight Express costumes had a terrific amount of subtlety. I once saw a version of Buffy the Buffet Cars costume where she had a hot dog on her head. And the thing is, with all the creatives that work on this show, is that the brief and the assignment, as the young people would say, is very different because they have specific things they need to achieve. And as all of these trains are going around and you have all of these different characters and they all need a certain amount of like protection and padding and helmets, they also need to be really clearly recognizable and identifiable. So you need these bright, vivid colors. You need to be able to tell Rusty apart. You need to be able to tell Greaseball apart. And Elektra, Hydra, the hydrogen, is bright green, which makes it really easy to tell them apart from the other freight trucks. So I have a very limited amount of time for criticism I'm seeing of these costumes that is saying, oh, the costumes are bad now. No, the costumes are different. The costumes are a different interpretation of Starlight Express. They're not that different from the original aesthetic. It's just taken that same idea and gone in a different direction because they couldn't replicate them because it's new creative work, which is what theatre thrives on. We can't just keep repeating and repeating and repeating the same thing. If you want to see those same costumes, you can. Get on a flight to Germany. Take a train there if you love trains that much. Anyway, carrying on to what I think is an admitted shortcoming of this production, which is the roller skating choreography. The skating itself is fine enough, but it doesn't really live up to Dame Arlene Phillips' choreography of the original show, where it really felt like they were dancing on roller skates. They do fun formations here, and you know, we do the most dancing happens in the Megamix and in the light at the end of the tunnel at the end of the show, and it kind of feels like they should have put as much of that in the beginning, in the first act, to give us more of that actual sense of dancing on roller skates, because it takes a long time for us to feel like they're really dancing. I also think, for what it's worth, and this is my own nostalgia speaking, that they took out the numbers that invited a little bit more choreography, like A Whole Lot of Locomotion, like Dinah's Disco when she reprises the melody of He'll Whistle at Me. The song that she now sings instead is not one that you as easily want to dance to, and for a lot of it, you know, they're just like skating around, they're coming or they're going, they're standing there and posturing, or they're singing and introducing themselves, but they're not really dancing. The other thing is the races, and the space is smaller than the theatre that they have for the show in Bochum. They don't have a bridge that lifts up and moves around and takes them to different levels. They don't skate up to a circle level. They have this one playing space, as I've described to you. They have a ramp that goes up to the back. They skate in two different loops around audience sections, but it's not huge. And that means, just in terms of physics, they can't get up to as high paces. The races are not as fast as perhaps they once were, or as perhaps they are in Germany. What I will say is that during the preview period, they have done an awful lot of work in making those races more exciting and bringing storytelling to them by adding in sort of the storytelling of the races and the reasons why people get disqualified or the reasons why people crash, and they've added effects in and commentary so the races feel more exciting and they feel more dynamic, even if the pace is not as fast as perhaps you might want it to be. Finishing with more creative praise though, the sound, and I've experienced this now from multiple different seating sections, sounds fantastic. The lighting is fantastic and sharp and crisp, both of them. And I've read in the programme that they're using really state-of-the-art technology to track the performers throughout the thing and where they are in the auditorium to amplify and light them properly, which is mind-blowingly cool. And everything about how they are delivering this show to you in terms of the technology is wildly impressive. I just think that on both a thrill front and on a theatrical storytelling front, you know, it's good but not great. And it's still impressive. This is still a massive cast on roller skates portraying this very wild and vivid story. For people who haven't seen Starlight Express before, I think they're going to still have their minds blown by this. And it doesn't necessarily have to be world leading and the biggest and best Starlight ever. I think just because it's the newest production, maybe that's what people are expecting, but this is not giving you the most high octane, the most like wild and out there and death defying Starlight Express there's ever been. Hopefully maybe less cast members get injured on this one. Let's cross our fingers for that. Speaking of which, let me tell you about some of the standout performances. Now, there are a lot of locomotives in this production. I'm not going to talk about every single performer. I'm going to talk to you about the ones who were standouts. Beginning with Jeevan Breit, the young man who is playing Rusty. He, like many others in the company, is making his professional debut in this show. He's got a beautiful voice. It is soulful, and he plays the angsty adolescent Luke Skywalker wanting to leave Tatooine thing very well. For a great many of the cast, the performances sort of invoke these pantomime comparisons because everything is played in a way that is by necessity very broad and slightly cartoonish. Like I said, the material is not Shakespeare, and they are playing trains racing around in a large auditorium, so you have to really demonstrate these emotions. But you root for and grow to care for his character. He sings the title song, Starlight Express, as well as I Am the Starlight in the second act beautifully. There is a lot of great singing in this show. I don't think anyone is having the best vocal day of their lives, simply by virtue of the fact that I don't think anyone has the best vocal day of their lives while on wheels. And there's just a technicality there in terms of like being able to support and a lot of like the mechanism of singing and like feeling stable and structured. No one is doing their best vocally on wheels. He still sounds fantastic, and he's very young, and that's wildly impressive. Jade Marvin, also lovely as Mama, the maternal energy that she brings to the thing, but also this sense of fun playing this older character who still wants to race and is still a little bit rambunctious. She's brilliant. She does a great job of landing the light at the end of the tunnel. It's this proper gospel number, and both because of the choreography by Ashley Nottingham in that moment and because of her performance, I think it's the strongest number in the show. Tom Pigram is also giving you vocals as Electra. It's a very campy, mysterious performance I have a lot of time for, but one of the biggest stars of the whole thing, Al Knott, who plays Greaseball. I think this is a star right here. The confidence of this performance, it's so wonderfully arrogant, and it's explosive and it's aggressive, but also there is such a joy in it. Like, oh my gosh, she's delighting in performing this. And when she first arrives, and just the attack with which she creates the first moments as this character, so cool. It just brings me so much happiness to watch this performance. Eve Humphrey, very funny and very charming as Dinah, doesn't really get much like character introduction until the second act. A big issue I have is that we don't get to meet the coaches in a way that feels as robust as previous productions, because they cut the bits where they sang about themselves in a slightly suggestive way. What's weird is there is a huge moment at the beginning of the show for the introduction of the ensemble trains, like the Silver Bullet and the Green Arrow, who don't really say anything. Like, they're other competitors in this big race, but they are not characters. They are very much background locomotives, and yet they have all of this pageantry and these long drawn out entrances where they get announced and their names come up in big graphics on the screens, and they wheel out, and then we cheer for each of them in turn. And we don't need to know their names, not really. We don't need to know which of those is which. But when we come to meet all of these important trains to the plot, it's like, oh yeah, that's Dinah, Taciturn, and Belle. Oh, and this is Pearl over here. Oh yeah, and then Rusty's coming, and these are new ones. Like, those ones matter, and we speed right through those sections. Kylie Monticello plays Belle, another one who's bringing you one of the great vocal performances in the show, and Jaden Veen plays Hydra. Now, Jaden is no stranger to wheels. Jaden has appeared in Starlight Express the musical in Bochum, Germany, and is clearly very comfortable on roller skates and is putting in a few little tricks and lots of spins here and there, but has that comfort that I think allows him to then put everything into the performance and the characterization, and really brilliant as a Hydra, and like doesn't necessarily have a lot of characterization to work with other than just like eagerness to be in the race and a lot of confidence about the capabilities of hydrogen as a fuel source, which is like, good for you. But it's a testament to what a confident and committed performance that is, that we latch on to that character as much as we do. Anyway, those have been my many thoughts about this new production of Starlight Express at the Troubadour Theatre in Wembley Park. I know a lot of people are going to have many thoughts. Feel free to comment everything that you think about this show down below, especially if you have actually seen it. In the meantime, I hope that you enjoyed this review video. Make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel, follow me on whatever podcast platform you may be hearing this on, and I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day. For 10 more seconds, I'm MickeyJoTheatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!